Yo, so I'm joined by Elias Williams, who's just come from breakfast because he's in Oxford in the United Kingdom, while I'm sitting here in Auckland, New Zealand, and different ends of the world, different meal times. Elias is the founder, is that true to say, of Mandem Hood, which is an awesome online platform for young men of color exploring masculinity and I guess like a whole range of social issues that fall out of that. I discovered Elias when I found a really, really awesome panel discussion that he and some of his brothers were having, looking at like grime and masculinity within, I guess, the UK context. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely.
And okay, rad. And Elias is also a filmmaker. You're making a feature film, right? I guess, is that like an adjunct to the work you're doing with Mandem Hood, or?
Not quite. Not quite. It's independent of that, but there are themes of boyhood and manhood in the film.
Okay, cool. Well, what got you interested, I suppose, in explicitly understanding masculinity? Because that's not something like a lot of young men roll with, you know? So I'm curious about like your journey to today.
Cool. Yeah, so very, very unintentional, I would say. So when setting up the Mandem platform, it was in response to another platform that had been set up called Mandem.com that you can check out, which is a platform centered around the identities of women of color, starting in the UK, starting in Bristol, the city where I was studying at the time. So I met with a lot of people in the creative community of Bristol, had a lot of conversations about race and diversity, as that was very big in the media discourse at that time, around 2017. And I kind of came to the conclusion that it would be really cool to set up a platform for men of color, to kind of openly discuss masculinity and race and how those two things intertwine. So yeah, had the conversations, used my filmmaking skills to kind of do interviews. I collected articles for the platform, and then yeah, we launched it. And it was more, to start with, I think it was probably more race orientated. It was more related to exploring elements of alternative Black history that hadn't been explored before, looking at discourse around diversity in the media in the UK. But at the same time, yeah, of course, it was a male-centered platform, but it wasn't so much a male-centered platform in that it was exclusionary to everyone else.
Yeah.
It was more a realization that Black males have been portrayed a certain way in the media historically, and we kind of wanted to take a bit more ownership and agency over that image that is constantly fed out via the media. So by doing that, it was nice to just show different elements of quote unquote Black masculinity. You know, we're not all rappers and gangsters and
Yeah.
whatever, you know. So that was kind of yeah.
I love that. I literally just came from dinner with a friend who's African American, and he lives in Los Angeles all of the time, and he's a musician. And we were talking about how when I first went to Los Angeles, because I, as like a New Zealand guy who is so far removed from that, and I'm white, and I grew up listening to NWA and all this, you know, like my mediated image of LA, in particular neighborhoods in LA, is so gangsters and violence, and you know, like those stereotypes do live large in people who don't walk in those paths, and that's, you know, to perhaps use an overused word, is really problematic, you know, because you're putting these huge generalizations around hugely divergent experiences, right? What sort of stereotypes do you find most troubling in the UK media? Is it the racialized stereotype that, you know, young Black youth are committing crime and yada, 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 and we need to have all these police interventions? Or, yeah, can you talk us through that?
Yeah, I mean, it's very complicated, and I'm by no means a genius on it all. But essentially, and I mean, this does start in America, of course. It's like when manhood is stripped from a people, which you could argue was the case with Black people, originating in slavery, the emasculation of men that occurred during slavery, and the constant exclusion from economic power and forms of social power through the legacy of racism. That then in some way, as a rejection of that exclusion from power, perhaps manifested its way into art such as hip hop, and then hip hop becomes an important avenue for self-expression, and for men in particular, it's obvious that it became an important portrayal of masculinity. And I think in some ways you can attribute the hyper masculinity that's apparent in hip hop to this response to the emasculation of Black men throughout history, right? So that's just a little bit of context to hip hop and grime. In the UK, obviously things are a little bit different, but yeah, there's a whole history of stereotyping of Black people in general, and Black men being portrayed as a thug, and this goes back to very disturbing ideas around Black males being a threat to white women. And there's famous cases such as the Emmett Till case in the United States, where a young Black boy was essentially lynched and was accused of just for the accusation of I think whistling at a white woman or something like that. So you've got this whole loaded history behind kind of the evolution of Black masculinity in the Western world, and inevitably it's led to certain stereotypes becoming prominent in the media. And an obsession with Black masculinity is something that's inherently aggressive, due to portrayals of masculinity in hip hop music. In the UK, in more recent times, there's particularly been a conversation around knife crime and London gangs and how they're predominantly Black, despite the fact that violence isn't a racialized thing. As you know, I'm sure it's, there's a rapper I'm a fan of called Akala who eloquently highlights that,
I like Akala, yeah.
Yeah, he's great. And he eloquently highlights that, young men in poverty are prone to violence. It happens in Glasgow. It happens everywhere.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because what if I'm listening correctly, the stereotype is that it's young Black men who are predisposed to violence, which is obviously a racist assertion, when as an explicit student of masculinity, we can say, well, it's young men in general who've got economic pressures and economic limitations and social class, and like the environments that they find themselves in due to social class lead to violence, right? It's not a race thing. It's a masculinity thing, because we're predisposed and taught and indoctrinated and shown that violence is a problem solving tool. And we don't have those other, I guess, outlets if you are economically limited, huh?
Exactly. And again, the class thing is massive, and it's often left on the sidelines. We're not talking about kind of middle class, wealthy Black boys going around killing each other. Like it is
an economic thing. Yeah, right. Yeah. It's the same here in New Zealand. Like, we have our Indigenous people are Māori, and we have a high percentage of Pacifica people, and those people are economically marginalized, and there's a long legacy of colonialism. And obviously we have all this sociological outcomes that you'd imagine, right? Like more incarceration, like you know, high rates of prosecution, like high rates of suicide, blah, 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 blah. So yeah, I find that a really sad, I guess as a white dude trying to help where I can, I find that a really sad commonality between my country and your country, United States, and indeed most contexts in the world, right? Like there is these parallels that we can all explore and address. I'm just trying to figure out, I guess, in my ripe old age, how to do it better. Like, what would you say to someone like me who's, you know, I've come from a working class background and now I find myself middle class and I put myself to university, and obviously I'm, you know, I'm of mixed race, but I'm white passing. Like, what's the role of a dude like me in allyship? Because I find that increasingly fraught and I'm kind of scared to fuck it up and get it wrong despite my best intentions, you know? So I'm like, how do I, do you know? Like, I don't know if that question makes sense.
I've had this question a lot, as you might imagine. And I think with the first step, the fact that you're introspective about it is undoubtedly a positive thing. The fact that you care to actually think about how you can involve yourself in allyship is important. A lot of people don't even bother thinking about that. They'll just dive straight in and whatever. And I'm also wary, as we kind of briefly touched upon before recording, the cancel culture and identity politics, culture war, whatever we want to call it, is definitely fueling the flames of division a lot. And I think now more than ever, unity is incredibly important. Why the UK is great is that its racial history is very different to the United States, where the United States had overt segregation and whatnot. And you actually find probably in a lot of ways a lot more class allyship in the UK, right? So a lot of it's not segregated. A lot of urban areas in London or whatever, inner city estates or whatever, are actually often racially diverse. So it's not like it's all black, you know.
Sure. Right. Yes, you don't have a black neighborhood or a white neighborhood. You've got a working class neighborhood.
Exactly. Yeah. So I don't think, you know, that there's already inherently an allyship between people of different races. You know, it's not, you know, there's plenty of white people who already understand the history of racism and what that means. So I often actually feel like the divisions between the races are often just like inflated for like political reasons. And that's not to diminish the fact that there are white people who don't understand racism as well as they could. But I think, I don't know if I'm offering advice, I think it's just listening. A lot of people don't want to listen, and that's in all walks of society. They don't want to listen to someone who has an experience to share. That's obviously the first step. And just being understanding, and also realizing as well that not all people who are championing anti-racism are actually right. You know, I think this is something that I think, you know, we touched on Megan Murphy in regards to feminism and womanhood. It's like, for example, a lot of the women who are championing, can't even speak now.
Championing, that's a hard word to say, bro. I got you.
Yeah, championing feminism, you know, are not necessarily the best representatives for all women, in the same way that some people who are championing anti-racism, black people or whatever, are not actually speaking on behalf of all black people. For example, there are plenty of black people who don't appreciate some of the things that Black Lives Matter represents, you know, so it's a difficult one.
I saw that is a tricky one, because we kind of, I guess what I was trying to say, we make these monoliths, right? Like, this group is all the same because of these characteristics, like all women or all black people, all white people, and that and social media like turns everyone into this flat 2D representation of their group, when in fact what you're saying, I think, is dead right. And I really, it heartens me to hear you say that, because there is diversity within any and every group, and yet it seems that at least online, or it is this kind of like, no, it's all of this or it's all of that, and none of the gray. Because I remember when I think it was Adele, she did like Bantu knots and like was wearing like a Jamaican shirt or flag or something. And I saw American Twitter going crazy about cultural appropriation, but then I saw Jamaican Twitter or Jamaican UK Twitter was like, yo, like big up Rude Girl. Like it's rad that you, sorry about my accent, but I had to try. Like
Not bad.
not bad. God damn. She's like, they're like, they really appreciated the fact that she was representing where she's from, which is this mixed race area in the UK. Is that, do you know what I mean? Like, I thought that totally. She was like, I'm a person from this neighborhood. I grew up with these people and I really love that culture. And I struggle with that as I guess, you know, I'm older now because I used to think like that. I'm like, fuck, I love blah, 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 blah. And now I'm kind of in this space where I'm scared of getting it wrong when I really just, yeah. And I feel like a lot of people who aren't like explicitly political, like I studied politics, university, and all this sort of stuff, they don't want to get involved in the conversation for fear of, oh, it's a bit hard and tricky and yada, yada, yada. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, man. And it's a terrible shame. And I think, you know, you were right to mention social media earlier. I think like, because what we're talking about here is the basics of communication as well. It's like, it is interesting to contemplate how technology is breaking down forms of communication, ironically, as it was supposed to be something that brought people closer together. But I totally hear what you're saying. And I have to honestly, you know, put my hand on my heart and admit that I've fallen victim to some of the kind of more regressive elements of identity politics in the past, where I perhaps got a little bit more triggered about cultural appropriation and whatnot. But after just doing more reading and
something we should all be doing, more reading, yeah,
gave me a better understanding of the world we live in. I mean, cultural appropriation is an age-old thing, and it's like it's how humans develop, right? And that's not to trivialize why people get frustrated by cultural appropriation. Again, cultural appropriation isn't one simple thing. There's different levels to it and different layers to it. One of the reasons some Black people get very triggered by cultural appropriation in the form of hairstyles, for example, is probably because of the underlying feelings of being subjected to racism on a wider scale or more systematically that they don't always know how to articulate. So it comes out in outbursts of like, I don't even understand the oppression that's happened to people of my skin color. But now that I can see a white woman like profiting off a hairstyle, like it's making me uncomfortable. It's like a cognitive dissonant thing. It's very strange and complicated, that racism can be reduced to a choice of hairstyle, while also realizing that hip hop's a big one. I know you're studying this at the moment. I mean, like, to think how much money, you know, an inherently Black art form has made for white corporations or white-led corporations, for me was always like a big example of appropriation that is problematic. I think, unfortunately, it can be conflated with things like hairstyle, but really, I think underlying all of this is the disempowerment that Black people often collectively feel just about their place in society.
What are you studying? You're writing a master's degree too, huh?
Yes, I am. So I'm looking at the early Hollywood cinema and the beginnings of the horror genre and the zombie, and actually how race was like a massive thing in early zombie films.
Really?
A lot of people don't know that, but it's really fascinating.
I'm one of those people. Let's roll with that. I'm curious. Educate me, man. Like,
yeah, so zombies as we know them today are not how they always were. So a zombie as a concept comes from Haiti, and it's tied to Haitian voodoo, which is like the religion of Haiti in it. And the religion stems from transatlantic slavery. It was a religion that was kind of formed as a amalgamation of spiritual practices by the slaves to kind of unify themselves in a spiritual context after having everything stripped away from them. And in Haitian voodoo, there's all sorts of interesting like spiritual stuff, but one of the figures that emerged from Haitian voodoo was this concept of a zombie, this idea that a man can be dispossessed of his spirit, obviously with underlying themes around slavery and disembodiment, you know, and this idea that a voodoo priest could control a body without a soul. Yeah, and it's really fascinating because this is all very prominent in the early Hollywood films. So the very first zombie film titled White Zombie is literally set in Haiti, and there's this like creepy kind of white European Haitian guy who's like zombifying these kind of people, and it's very interesting. Yeah.
And are you doing this, I guess, out of just general academic curiosity, or does this tie into the representations of race that we've been talking about today? Like, are you looking at like the antecedents of, is that the right word? Like the predecessors to the stereotypes that we see today? Is that kind of what underpins it?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, totally. It's related to that. Also, it's related to the fact that I'm quite a big fan of history. A lot of the films I've made have been related to history and African history and alternative Black history. And one of the most fascinating events in alternative Black history is the Haitian Revolution. It was the only ever successful slave rebellion. And a lot of people don't know about it. So that's what kind of led me to learning about the zombie genre.
Okay, wow. That's fascinating. That is a fascinating, I think that's one of the cool things about academia, is that you can become an expert in something like super niche, but then you extrapolate that knowledge out, and it helps make sense of the world that we live in, and how you actively are going to apply that knowledge as you move through life to make the world better, huh?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
is your filmmaking explicitly activist filmmaking?
No, not really. So again, that's for the viewer to decide. I think some of them, I mean, by inherently exploring untold African history, there's probably something activisty, artivisty about that.
What sort of film do you make? Activisty film? Yeah.
But yeah, no, I don't think you know, art is art. You know, I think, you know, to conflate that with real activism is a little bit disingenuous. I think it doesn't do justice to people who are genuinely being activists, you know.
That's interesting. I used to have this professor at university, and she was big into like film as a form of, I guess, activism. Like we did a lot of Latin American, I did Spanish and Latin American politics and stuff. And she looked at how minority voices and like indigenous voices use film as a way of, I guess, expanding consciousness and showcasing the reality of their lived experience and their lived history. And I guess you're saying, well, to some degree, but what's real activism to you? You know, like what is you?
I mean, I absolutely understand the power that film has, and I think it can have a tremendous impact in giving voices to the voiceless and whatnot. I suppose it depends on the definition of activism. I mean, people who are like out in the street setting up charities or whatever it is, you know what I mean?
What do you feel is activism these days? Because sometimes I get frustrated with that. I'm like, yo, you talk about stuff a lot on social media, but is that really activism? Like, I guess to some degree, but there is a difference between someone who's got like an activist Instagram account and someone who is organizing talks and working with charities and donating food drives. And yeah, what is activism to you? Or do we not have to put a box on it?
Yeah, I'd probably go with the latter. I have no idea. Unfortunately, I'm not the best man to explain activism, but again, it's one of these things, isn't there? There's different levels to it. I mean, we're living in a society where people think that a tweet or a post on Instagram is activism, and I think that's a little bit problematic.
Yeah, slacktivism is the term that a lot of people use these days, right? Yeah, I agree with you. I like how I'm really engaged with how nuanced you strike me. Like, you strike me as looking at things in a very balanced way, and that's kind of refreshing. I guess I'm a bit caught up in my head looking at the culture wars, as you touched on, as this real people are one way or the other, and we have to pick a team, and being a moderate or being progressive but pragmatic strikes me as a rare find. But here you are.
Well, it's been a journey to get here, but also I genuinely believe that the majority of people are moderates. I think, you know, a lot of people will tell you that actually the large majority of people are moderates. They're not one thing or the other. They float in between ideologies. They're not dead set on one idea of how the world should be or whatever. But unfortunately, due to our clickbait media system, the people with extreme views steal the limelight. So they're the ones who are most interesting and will get the most clicks on Twitter and the most retweets, the most. I mean, it's tied to ad revenue as well with media platforms. They need controversial titles and headlines to just make money. So I think that's why it feels like pragmatism has disappeared. It's because extreme views sell.
I think tying back into the concepts around like masculinity that we both have an interest in exploring, I find that it's vital to temper my passion and idealism with, if I just go talk to a room full of dudes who are into football and beer, and they've never had these explicit conversations, and I talk about toxic masculinity and the patriarchy, they're going to tell me to fuck off and call me a jerk off. And like, it's not going to be like a well-spent time. Whereas exactly. if I meet them where they're at, if I meet them where, then I might not. My goal isn't to like shift their worldview, but it might plant a few seeds, and they might reflect on that. And I guess I'm kind of at this point where I think change is slow rather than necessarily radical. Although you can have a radical heart. What do you think of that?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. Change is painfully slow, and
painfully slow. I wish it wasn't, but it is, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And people don't have much patience, you know? So I think, especially with regards to the masculinity conversation, it's like, Jesus Christ, what, you want to go to a group of men who are perhaps unhealthy or living some kind of unhealthy masculine lifestyle and start preaching radical feminism to them and expect them to listen to you. It's like, that's crazy. I mean, so it's kind of like, I do think that people have to be more understanding of the conditions that create who we are as individuals. You're not just, I genuinely believe in the idea that we are all socially conditioned beings. So our environments shape us. I don't think that's a radical idea. I think like if someone, even, and I'd extend that to racists. I'd be like, you're not a racist because you were born racist. It's learned behavior.
I love that. That you would say that. It's like you're compassion. I'm not trying to like gas you up and like suck you off over Zoom, but like that is a really compassionate, refreshing, empathetic take to take on someone who might have a hateful view towards, people of color, African migrants, or whatever, like, rather than fuck those people, I want to burn them and throw them into the sea. You're like, they were probably made that way, and maybe we can unmake them. But that's not going to get a retweet, is it? Like, that's not going to go viral. Like patience and kindness. Yeah, it could. Maybe we should start that. Like, let's make like patience and slow change trend somehow.
Depending where you look, you will find that. I think there's an increasing acknowledgement that the polarization of society is uncomfortable and destructive. And I personally have seen platforms that try and explore the middle ground a little bit more, whether it's like, I know you think what you want about him, but Joe Rogan's position
I love Joe Rogan.
He very much appears to me as someone who is constantly exploring the middle ground, and not getting carried away with the extremes of either end of an argument. And I think, so you asked why you know, I think you mentioned that you yourself have slight mixed heritage. So I'm also of mixed heritage. I think perhaps that has offered me some insight into the nuances of race as well.
Mm. Yeah, my mother's family's from Lebanon, and we don't speak Arabic. I'm like a fifth generation, but like my grandfather is like, well, he's passed now, but like he looks Middle Eastern, you know. And we're going through all these family history photographs at my mother, who's in her 60s now. And I was like, yo, we were like fresh off the boat, like coming, you know, you know what I mean? Like they immigrated here in like the 19th century, and it must have been such a, I don't know, I can't, you know, like it must have been so jarring, like the cultural differences. And I talked to my grandfather when he was still alive, and they got a hard time at school, him and his brothers, for being so visibly different in that, you know, in that era. And I do wonder how that's landed in me, because while I get a good tan and I have a penchant for gold chains, like I'm not, do you know, I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with like Australian Lebanese community, but we're all about like slick back hair and kickboxing and gold chains. It's a thing. Anyway, yeah, I don't feel like I don't know. I feel like I have like an empathy for my heritage, but I'm not quite sure how it's showing up in my life. Does that make sense? Whereas what you've been talking about is quite different, you know, like talking to my bro today, like he's African American, and his experiences in America with police and authorities are different due to his skin color, whereas that's not something I've ever had to deal with, you know. So I don't know what the point is to that fucking story, but
I mean, we're all human first, man.
yeah, and that's it. What do you think of the whole concept of it's racist to not recognize race? Have you seen that conversation though?
Yeah.
Like,
I mean,
if you don't see skin color, that's like a racist thing in your privilege. And I'm like, okay, I understand that, but like, I guess I err towards what you've said, Elias, which is we're all human first.
Yeah,
But again, I go back to like, I'm scared of getting that wrong.
Yeah, well, it's a tricky one, man, because it's like, because I've thought about this a lot, and it's like, if there hadn't been a history of subjugation of people because of their skin color, then sure, just not seeing color would be fine, but it would be kind of, there's of course loads of differences between the Holocaust and transatlantic slavery or whatever, but I suppose it's the same way as in like, would you not acknowledge I wonder how the Jewish community would feel if they were not, if their kind of history was not acknowledged, you know, and what happened in Nazi Germany, if it was like, oh no, I just see you as a human, I don't really care what happened to people of your religion a few years ago, I just see you as a person. It's those kind of things that just have to be accounted for. It doesn't mean that you have to treat someone differently. It's just that it's just respectful to learn a little bit about
other people's histories, you know. Yeah, but then at the same time, not treat them different because of that, but in awareness and listening and a degree of sensitivity.
And I wonder if it's actually just a transition period. It's like, to get to the place where we don't see color, we have to educate ourselves, because that's the destination we're aiming for, right? So to assume that we can just kind of like skip the hard bit and just get there overnight is maybe a little bit lazy. I don't know.
And you think we're in the hard bit now, right? Like we're having these good conversations. Yeah, right. I like that. I like that take a lot, because, excuse me, like you, I would like to be in a Martin Luther King speech where people aren't judged by the color of their skin, but by the contents of their character and their hearts. And we judge people for who they are rather than their, like, racism makes me profoundly sad, you know? I used to be married to a mixed race woman, and like, I think that gave me a real firsthand empathy for what it was like to actively be treated differently as a child because of the way you looked. And ever since then, that's really, you know, it's a long time ago, dude. I'm old, but like, it's really stuck with me. And then to hear these conversations now, I think is really heartening, but at the same time, they're quite fraught with, you know, the shit that we've been alluding to. coming back to masculinity, how do we help the dudes who don't have those chats come into the fold? How do you go about it?
That's no easy question. I think
I don't feel I've had any easy questions tonight. I'm sorry.
Mate, don't worry. I'm asking myself these tough questions every day, so it's nothing new. I think that for one, as much as we probably like struggle to acknowledge it, there have been improvements in the way men carry themselves. I mean, you only have to go back, you know, a few years to, you know, for example, in the U.K, I believe that, like, you know, rape was legal if it was your wife, you know, not too long ago. I mean, there's, so it's another slow process. I think it can be particularly difficult to meet people where they are. In fact, in one of the discussions we had, a really interesting point was raised. The question of the event was, do men need feminism? And one of the issues was that quote unquote feminism wasn't accounting for the class struggles of men of color, that perhaps has breeded an environment where, as a defense mechanism, there has to be an element of toxicity to their approach to manhood, almost as a defense mechanism, which is quite an interesting concept. For example, when you are under threat from the society, whether via economic oppression or from the police, it's like you don't want to make yourself vulnerable necessarily that easily. So there's all sorts of questions like that. So you do wonder if, you know, there's more nuance, like we've talked about, relating to other struggles that men go through. Perhaps there's ways to open up a conversation about what it means to be a good man.
Yeah, I really love that you say that. I gave a talk at a maximum security prison here. And, you know, talking about manhood and masculinity, and, you know, we're all tough, we don't cry, and we use violence, we cover ourselves in tattoos, and we patch up and join gangs and shit. And then one of the brothers was like, yo, man, I appreciate what you're saying, but what, you think I'm going to be vulnerable here? I'm surrounded by gangsters. And I was like, you have a point. And what you're talking about is how more broadly in society, and particularly for young male Black youth, I can totally understand that need to armor up and be defensive or have that toxicity, right? Because it keeps you safe. You know, like the way so many men, like, we have an incredibly high suicide rate in New Zealand, particularly for young men, particularly for young Māori men. And a lot of that, I do think, comes down to the fact that we're socialized to not be emotionally expressive and ask for help. And we have that whole like stoic tradition. But at the same time, I understand that, because when you do put your fucking walls down, it's painful, right?
Yeah. Are you one guy who I initially didn't like for a variety of reasons, but I've come to understand his philosophy more, is Jordan Peterson. I wonder how you feel about Jordan Peterson, if you're familiar with him.
I'm not really familiar with him. I've seen all the outrage about him. I once posted a Guardian or a BBC series that really cool woman was presenting, and I forget her name, but I really, really like her work. And it was around manhood and masculinity. And I just posted like some article that she had written that referenced him, and like the internet went crazy. And, you know, I heard about the sexual hierarchies of crabs or something. And that's about, yeah, lobsters. That's right. And that's the extent of it. Like, he seems to have been tainted by cancel culture. And I guess, to be honest with you, Elias, I've kind of, I don't want to be tainted too by talking about him publicly. So I've not explored his thinking.
which is crazy, right? Because I mean, like, because I felt the same way a few years ago, but for whatever reason, recently I decided to just have a read of his books. I think I'd seen a clip of him on Joe Rogan, and he said something really insightful. So I thought, you know what, I'll give him a chance and do a bit of digging and explore who he is and all of that. And actually, there's quite a lot of insightful stuff in his work, and I think why he's become so popular amongst young men and men in general is because he perhaps speaks to the enormous societal changes that are occurring and that make men feel isolated in their roles. So, for example, this hyper inflation of society being a tyrannical, patriarchal, white male-led structure is inevitably going to make a lot of white men feel a little bit isolated and a little bit alone and a bit it's not going to have a positive effect when people are telling you, society's constantly telling you there's something wrong with you. Being a man is inherently toxic. It's inherently, tyrannical and dominant orientated, when it's actually a lot more complicated than that. It's not like men are singularly wrong in everything they do. There's also biological reasons why the characteristics of men and women are different. And to ignore that is a little bit disingenuous.
Yeah, guys, look, I've worked in alcohol and drug harm reduction. I've do a lot of mental health advocacy. Like chronic addiction runs through my family, as does like family violence and shit. And I've had a whole bunch of friends around me. So in a personal, who are fucking, they're all on one. If I went up to them and made them feel like shit, and like, you're a fucking loser, you fucking blah, 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 they're not going to want to change, are they? They're just going to retreat into their old mechanisms, no matter how destructive those mechanisms are for them. And I guess the line I'm trying to draw is that that's what happens in this moment in time where we use words like male privilege, which is academic jargon that most regular dudes don't understand. Mm-hmm. And I think it comes back to like, how do we be pragmatic with reaching the people who don't already get it? And mm-hmm. I think you're dead right in what you've said about the popularity of someone like Jordan Peterson, who is hugely popular, like hugely, like, while I've never read his work, there are millions of like angry, isolated young men out there who like his self-help books. And I think, again, it speaks to your pragmatic and empathetic approach to activism to recognize that.
What privilege does a homeless man have?
Yo, fuck. See, this is the thing, man. That's why, yeah, that's it. That's what, like, I know a lot of working class brothers, and like, I see people who are economically privileged, but they might be a woman, or they might be of color or whatever. And they've had like a pretty nice ride through life to this point, in spite of those intersections. And I'm probably going to get canceled for saying this, whatever. But, like, there are those intersectional barriers to women and people of color and different sexualities. I'm not denying that. But when a fucking dude who's had every fucking shit thing happen to him, and he's got fuck all money, and he's been in and out of jail his whole life, and he just happens to be white, and he just happens to be a man, here's that. I'm privileged, really? Like, I can totally understand. Like, really? I'm the privileged guy here from some thought piece or blah, 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 blah. I totally get why they'd be like, fuck that. That's nonsense. I'm never going to buy into that. And
exactly, man. And, not to get conspiratorial with it, but you could argue that all the identity politics stuff is inevitably a deflection of the class conversation. It's a deflection away from talking about more serious and difficult things like socio-economic inequality.
I really appreciate this. Is cool, man. Like, well, I'm having a good time. I hope you're having a good time, because I wonder that, like, I'm not saying necessarily it's a conspiracy, but I went to university after going to Latin America a couple of times, and I really wanted to understand the extreme poverty that I'd seen there, like children licking plates, you know, kids who are homeless. Like we have, you know, this back in the day, we had homeless in New Zealand, but not to the extent that we do now. But it was rare compared to, you know, I went to New York, and then I went to went to Mexico and stuff. And that was like this harsh economic disparity that I'd not experienced before. And I wanted to understand those things what was the political impetus that led to this inequality. And that's kind of how the lens that I've looked at the world through for a long, long time. And now that conversation seems to really be on the sideline, and everything is this very neoliberal individualistic conception of one's role in the world, rather than looking at the commonalities that you've spoken to, Elias, that we do have more in common as humans, and that, like in the UK, you have a working class neighborhood rather than a black and a white neighborhood, and that we've got more in common within that. Yeah, I do wonder how we, like, how do we have both those conversations at the same time and not give primacy to one over the other? I guess, is that something that you ponder?
Yeah, man, absolutely. I'll quickly shout out, just so it's in case anyone wants to check them out. You might be familiar with them. Bell Hooks and Robert Jensen are both, you know, brilliant authors.
I love Robert Jensen. Thank you for yo. This is me fist bumping you.
I interviewed him.
Did you?
Yeah. I'll show you. I'll send it to you, and I could put you in touch with him if you want.
Finish this train of thought, and then let's talk about Robert Jensen.
Yeah, for sure. I absolutely ponder can we do both? Can we critique first world racism and also look at the socio-economic inequality between nations? So one of my issues with the whole kind of modern anti-racism or Black Lives Matter is that it's all kind of like about first world stuff. No one seems to give a shit about the fact that the majority of brown and black people are in the poorest nations on the earth, right? So it's like, you know, it can drive you crazy. It's like, how can you be so obsessed with a hairstyle when...
Or a microaggression when so many people are fucking starving.
Exactly, when millions of people are subject to cholera from water, drinking water. It's like, it's kind of a massive cognitive dissonance, but that's not to trivialize first world issues, because when racism is brought up correctly and thoroughly in the first world, it is often attached to the history and legacy of colonialism and racism on a wider scale. And that does incorporate the kind of economic subjugation of third world countries.
Yes.
So I think again, it's, you know, it sounds crazy, but it's all about nuance, man. It's all about nuance.
What about Robert Jensen though? Like, I know it's a bit of a shift moving from race to masculinity, and, you know, I guess that's the whole nature of the conversation.
He's race conscious. So Robert Jensen has a book titled The Heart of Whiteness, where he explicitly addresses his, his position. Yeah.
I'm not familiar with that. I've only I've came to Robert Jensen through his work around like pornography and radical feminism. But did you come to him through his explorations of race?
No, it was through masculinity as well, and radical feminism. And an important thing to mention as well is that his version of radical feminism is completely incorporates class struggle and acknowledges economic disparities and how they relate to each other. And that's what, you know, why, you know, it's the true radical feminism that's, you know, second wave feminism that started in the 60s, 70s, whatever, is the same stuff that Megan Murphy talks about. It's very different from a kind of liberal, individual-centered feminism that talks about, oh, we need more like CEOs, millionaires, and whatever it is who are female. It's like, okay, that's great, but there's obviously a wider conversation to have. But yeah, Robert Jensen's great. Again, there's a fine line between acknowledging the negative aspects of masculinity and demonizing them. So I think that's a you know, a line that needs to be tread carefully. But I think he does a decent job.
I think he does a really good job about that. Yeah, I discovered him. I've talked about this a bit in a million and one other conversations, but you know, I was listening to a lot of punk rock and hardcore music and political hip hop, and went like vegetarian, and I started like reflecting on like the process of production and consumption, and then it really made me think about porn. I was like, oh yeah, I look at quite a lot of porn, and then I started reading his work, and it really made me feel hypocritical in my use of porn. Like I had no idea about the lived history of those female actors and what led them there, and that they might have had a whole bunch of coercive things that led them to that day, or fucking sexual abuse, or like the broader society that we live in, which still commodifies female bodies for male pleasure and financial gain. And it really led me onto this path that's led me to talking to you, to be honest with you. Like his early writing really made me stop and shift and reflect on who I am as a man, and what, and that's where I guess I want not all men to be, but I do wish more men could reflect on, those things from a place of empathy rather than from a place of shame. And perhaps that's where some of this modern conversation comes from. It's like, guys, as you talk about, there is kind of a lot of people, all men are bad and hashtag men are trash, and, you know, these kind of unhelpful stereotypes, which I get, you know, like women do live in fear of violence, sexual predation, sexual harassment, yada, 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 at the hands of men. But this demonization of masculinity isn't going to be helpful in shifting that, is it?
Not at all, man. And again, it's like, who are the people who are hashtagging men are trash? I can tell you right now, they're not, but they're not representative of all women. Like that's the other thing.
Word.
This comes back to the what should we call it? The kind of neglection of the moderates. Like most people are moderates. They're not going around saying men are trash or white people are evil. Like most people are not doing that. Like,
you strike me as a lot more confident in your politics than I am. Like I feel like I've had this crisis of faith, and I'm all like, I don't really fucking know who I am anymore. Like, please love me. Like,
well, I've kind of been on this journey for at least 4, I mean, longer than that, 5 years, 6 years, you know, since I was like 17 or whatever, 18. So I've had a long time to arrive at this point, you know, it's not just come overnight. And the world's changed a lot in that time. So I've had to adapt and think and expand my horizons and what I'm also quite keen on looking at the opposite argument to my belief, because it will help inform your belief.
Yeah, I'm big on that too. Well, fuck, man. Like I've been thinking about this shit for like over a decade, you know, reading and yada, yada, yada. And I was one of those painful dudes who'd try and lecture a bunch of like bros about radical feminism. And it's through trial and error and being a fucking dickhead when I was younger that has made me go, that doesn't work. Like it just doesn't work. And if I want men to, for their own self, like to be better dads and to be happier and be less, you know the statistics better than me probably. Like men are more likely to die of violence and more likely to commit violence, whether it's at their own hands or the hands of another brother, you know. I want that to change, and it is that softly approach. Not in a softly, that's wrong, but that pragmatic approach, which is essential to doing that. How do you bring your personal friends in? Because outside of this shit, I'm a kickboxing coach, man. Like I hang out with bros and like teach them how to like knock other men out, you know. Like so, I'm always in these like alpha male spaces all the time, and that's been informative of the work, you know. And how do you bring your friends who never have these chats into them? Because
well, I think that's incredibly important, that you're that you're in those alpha spaces, and as a kickboxer, it can provide an element of empathy to the arguments you're bringing. And I think that, you know, the responsibility in some ways is on, so I'm interested in this idea of, for example, to really eradicate racism, it kind of has to come from informed, intelligent white people, right? Because it's not always, I think we put a lot of emphasis on the quote unquote oppressed to fix their oppression, which is kind of crazy, right? So in the same way that
right.
sexism, it's like, oh, right, so women have to be the champions of like feminism and whatever. And it's like, even though often it's that men are the perpetrators, it's actually like when real change actually manifests is probably when the quote unquote dominant group starts doing the work. And I think in relation to what you're just saying there is that quote unquote alpha males, or men who are not stereo, because I think there's this idea, and we're seeing it as well, that it's kind of soft to expose vulnerability, or it's like it says something about your manhood that you're not quite a real man if you care about vulnerability and men's role in sexism or whatever. It's some kind, it's emasculating in some way if you have those thoughts. But I think that's why it's crucial for people like you who actually tick some of the boxes of what makes a man a real man, you know, being able to defend oneself and fight, leading these conversations, because it then acts as a gateway for men who are cynical about the conversation to actually understand that, hang on a minute, if someone who could beat me up is talking about this stuff, then like, shit, he might be onto something.
Yeah, I'm mindful of that. And actually, I have this workshop series that I have funding from the government to deliver, where, you know, I've got like a couple of UFC fighters on board, and they come and teach mixed martial arts, and another bro teaches like Muay Thai. Then I come in, I'm like, yo, what's up? We're talking about healthy masculinity. And then I've got another bro who talks about mental health, who are like, he's you know, well-educated lecturer and stuff. And it's taking the mountain to Muhammad, right? Like, those guys aren't normally going to have those conversations. And it's kind of like Trojan horse approach. Because you're right. Like, I get a bro pass because I've got heaps of tattoos, and historically I used to be good at like knocking people unconscious, which is, for me as a hurt kid with not a lot of self-esteem, that was my armor, you know, like that was, oh, yo, if I'm tough, people will like me more. And it was good to a point, you know, but then it didn't take away my inner pain and my, you know, my mental health struggles and like dealing with the dysfunction, you know, it didn't take away my dysfunction. It just armored it up to some degree, and to its credit, gave me a positive lifestyle that kept me away from like drugs and gangs and all the shit that like was on offer. But now I try and leverage off, that historical thing in order to have tricky conversations with bros. Is there people like Akala who have, I guess, well, what's the word I'm trying to say? I guess like credibility with regular men who are leading those conversations around manhood in the UK? Like, who are some voices that you think I should listen to? Apart from your own, I mean, apart from Mandem Hood, like, I love what you're doing.
Thank you, man. I appreciate that. So there's another MC that you might be familiar with called Loki, who's quite conscious. But again, it's like even then, it's like they, you know, because it's a complicated conversation. Just what you were saying there made me think, actually, you know, the more secure a man is about his identity, his masculinity, in some ways, the less toxic he'll be. You know, like a truly secure man isn't going to be violent and misogynistic. Do you know what I mean? I
do know what you mean, because what people always critique me, they're like, how can you be like this anti-family violence advocate and love Muay Thai and kickboxing and MMA and that? And I'm like, because the more secure someone is in and of themselves, the less likely they're going to use violence as a problem-solving tool. like violence against oneself or another person stems from a lot of insecurity and the inability to process your emotions. And on a basic level, because a lot of guys know they're tough, they don't need to show they're tough to other men all the time. Like young men out in the street knocking one another unconscious or king hitting one another and fucking killing each other by mistake are showing their masculinity. They're performing their masculinity all the time because they want to be accepted by the group. When you know that, yo, I don't need to do this anymore. I don't need to show how tough I am. I like myself as I am. I don't need to show everyone else how fucking good I am at hurting other people in this masculine performance. You know what I mean? So I think you're dead right in that. I think a lot of destructive behavior stems from this place of insecurity. And it's about how do you help men. It doesn't have to be martial arts or combat sports or sport at all, because that is a narrow definition of manhood. But how do we help men find these rites of passage that have often...
A lot of it's happening behind closed doors as well. It's again, like we talked about, it might not make headlines in the media, but there's plenty of black male leaders in their respective communities doing the work on the ground, trying to pull men out of a culture of crime, you know, whether that be in London or wherever. Like, it is happening. There are men out there who do that work, but again, it's like they're not influencers. They haven't got like 1 million followers on, you know what I mean? It's like it is happening,
bro. Yeah, I do. It fucking bums me out because, you know, I don't know about, like, everyone's got a mental health problem, right? Like, it's a global pandemic in the West. Well, at least in the Western world, everyone's anxious and depressed, and like there is this primacy of negativity through our social media feeds and our mainstream media feeds because it gets clicks, like you said, Elias. But like you say, there are so many good things happening out there, you know, outside of these arguments about race and masculinity. Like, there are 1,000,001 good things happening, but we never hear about them. Like, you have to go out of your way to find some obscure good news website, right? And it makes me, I don't know, like it bums me out because so many people I know struggle quite profoundly with their mental well-being, and that plays out sometimes in suicide and other times in substance abuse and other times in just lives not lived to their fullest. Sorry, I'm talking myself down into like, I started like real pumped when I met you and I wasn't even making sense. And now I'm all like, just talking.
There's a lot wrong with the world, man, but you got to start where you stand, man. It's like you can't click your fingers like Thanos and make the world a better place, you know? Like, you can only influence your social circle and whatever, you know? And
yeah. Do you think you're an optimist or a pessimist?
A pessimist, but I do my best to work towards being an optimist, probably. I think it's a fluctuating thing, right? You're pessimistic about some things, you're optimistic about other things, you know? It's a fluctuation.
Yeah. I think I err to optimism. I personally, but I'm cognizant that the world's quite fucked, you know, in lots of ways. But I think if it wasn't for some, like, it will get better, I would feel defeated, you know? Like,
has it not always been fucked? Because I think people forget
yeah,
that.
that's a good point. Yeah, I was asking my friend this yesterday. I was like, do you think the world's like way more fucked now? He's like, I don't know, bro. Like, the Middle Ages didn't sound that awesome. Like,
exactly.
yeah. I think it's just that we're more hyper aware of it, right? Due to all the things we've been talking about. But I know you've got a day to get on with. I've really enjoyed talking to you. It's been really fun for me to explore these like difficult ideas. And you're so graceful at articulating things, and you seem so open-minded. And I just really am heartened by the chat, man. So thank you so much for taking time out to talk with this random excitable dude on the other side of the world. And I'm really looking forward to following your work in the future. And yeah. If there's anything you want to shout out or anything you want to mention before we peace out.
Oh, I just appreciate you. Thank you for inviting me on. And I don't get to have these conversations all the time. So it's always nice to seek them out when they're presented to me. So yeah, I appreciate you offering to talk to me today.
No, it's like, I'm the same, man. I often feel kind of like alone in my thoughts. So I appreciate you allowing me to flesh them out. And I'm a complete stranger to you. So you've been really graceful and gracious. And thank you for sharing your knowledge with me, man. I appreciate it.
Thank you, bro. Enjoy your evening or
Yeah,
your night.
yeah, it's bedtime here, man.